I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Some of our select board meetings, we've talked that it's time to try and pull the public in and gather as much information at this point as we can to feel what is in the best interest of our community and its members to move forward one way or the other. Tonight is really, again, public discussion. We have a number of people here with us. Julie Marks from the Vermont Short-Term Rental Alliance is with us online, who will do a short presentation for us. We'll have some questions. I believe also Granicus, a member from Granicus, which is one of the company that we registered with for short-term rental data collection, is a member that is here that can possibly field some questions as well. So again, we're really looking to have a public forum discussion as to where we feel as a community we need to go. And from that point, we can take the necessary steps to make a proper decision that we feel is going to be the best for this town. So again, thank you all for coming. With that, Julie, are you there?
Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you. So I will thank you for joining us very much. I appreciate you taking the time. I will defer the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen here. I have a few slides. Okay, is that looking good to you?
Yes. Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Okay. As well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you all today. My name is Julie Marks. I am the founder and director of the Vermont Short-Term Rental Alliance. Just a little bit about me to introduce myself. I grew up in Heinsberg, born and raised in Vermont. Lived here most of my life, although I spent most of my 20s traveling abroad and living in other places. And about 5-6 years ago, found myself longing to come back to Vermont and get into more of a homesteading type lifestyle. And so I live now in Jericho, Vermont, and have found myself, not really intentionally so, but mostly out of necessity, in the vacation rental industry now. And for 3 years have been leading and developing this organization, first of its kind in Vermont, but certainly not unique to the industry nationwide, to help really do education and write the rules for this industry, as we all know, are a little underdeveloped. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. The Short-Term Rental Alliance, again, we are Vermont nonprofit, member-based business association representing the vacation rental community, both owners and property management companies. So our membership is currently a little over 200 and always growing. And our members are households and property management companies and sole proprietors who operate in this space. We also partner with a number of local businesses that are affiliated to the tourism industry. And our three main objectives are to work with governments to help develop reasonable and enforceable regulations for the industry, as well as setting standards for our members and educating them to responsible hosting practices. So we really set the bar for the industry and for a level of quality that all visitors and guests who stay at vacation rentals can expect to experience and our neighbors can trust. And then we also do a lot of effort towards building connections between the vacation rental community and other local businesses. So we put on events here and there. We were down in Ludlow last year, and I hope to do another community event in person in Ludlow again in the next few months. So hopefully we'll get to be able to meet some of you who I don't know yet in person in the near future. But you can learn more about us online. We have a lot of resources on our website and some more background. But today I am just going to present a few things to you about what we know about short-term rentals and what we don't know about short-term rentals, and try to provide some further considerations for you around what to consider when regulating this industry, with some watch-outs and recommendations. And I'm happy to stick around for questions during the discussion as well. First, just a quick note about data sources. The data that I'm going to present comes from a lot of different places because we don't have a comprehensive data package or database for this industry, but we do partner with a lot of industry data analyzers, such as Key Data, Lighthouse, AirDNA. We also partner with and have access to some insider data from the platforms Airbnb and Vrbo. And then we also partner regularly with Vermont Housing Finance Agency and the Department of Tourism and other partner agencies, Landlord Association, Realtors Association, the Lodging Association, et cetera, to try to pool and aggregate the data that we do have to get the most comprehensive picture of what's going on. So I wanted to start with just kind of some non-arguable facts of where we are right now in short-term rental regulation. So the state in 2018 passed Act 10, which was an act to regulate short-term rentals. And in that act, a definition was created as well as authorities granted to different departments for various purposes. The only real tangible thing that came out of this act was the development of the short-term rental health and safety financial obligations form, which is on their website and is required to be posted in every short-term rental unit in the state. The problem with this is great. It touches on a lot of safety concerns and health and education concerns and tax obligations. But the problem was that it was never required to be filed anywhere. And there was very little public outreach and education to make people aware that this form even existed. But it does exist, and that is essentially all that we have at the state level in terms of regulation around short-term rentals. I know that municipalities across the state have been focusing on this more and more in the past couple of years. We are attempting to track what's going on in different communities so that we can all see what each other is doing and learn from one another and keep up with the changes. It's very difficult to do. Again, no centralized database for the state of Vermont. But what we do have compiled is on our website, vstra.org/regs. The definition of a short-term rental is a furnished house, condominium, or other dwelling room or self-contained dwelling unit rented to the transient, traveling, or vacationing public for a period of fewer than 30 consecutive days. The caveat in this definition is that if somebody wants to rent their home for less than 2 weeks or 14 days in a calendar year, this definition essentially exempts them from being obligated to pay taxes and post the obligations form. But in general, there we go. But in general, there are several things that distinguish between a short-term rental, a lodging establishment, and a long-term rental. We just held a 3-day conference in November and did a session on the difference between a 30-day rental and a 29-day rental. And it was incredible to for me to learn and realize how many people didn't understand that they were stepping into a completely different jurisdiction at 30 days. But I'll touch on that a little bit more later. But it's important to know that when we're talking about a short-term rental, we're talking about a rental period that's less than 30 days. We're talking about a rental that does not provide food service, that exists on a property with fewer than 3 other rented units. So if it's a property that has 3 short-term rentals on one lot, then it is required by state law to apply for a lodging license through the Department of Health. Short-term rentals are required by law to pay the meals and rooms tax at 9%, as well as the local option tax where that's been adopted. But there's no licensing requirement otherwise, just posting that obligations form. So some types of short-term rentals that we have in Vermont here, we classify them kind of as alternative versus traditional. So alternative short-term rentals are ones that are a little bit more experiential, yurts, tree houses, tiny homes, RVs, versus traditional short-term rentals, which are your ADUs, accessory dwelling units, townhouses, single-family homes, camps, and rooms within people's homes. And there are 2 ways that short-term rentals are generally managed, either by the owner, which we call RBO, rented by owner, and that's where the owner self-manages the property, and they may or may not be on site while doing so. This is the model that you typically think of when you think of a property that's listed on a platform like Airbnb or VRBO. The other type of management is one that's done by a professional property manager. This is called vacation rental management. And this is when the homeowner has hired a full service management company to take care of the property and do all the guest communications, et cetera. And that typically is something that the vacation rental management company has exclusive rights over. They typically don't advertise on platforms like Airbnb. They tend to have their own direct booking marketing system. And, this is in Vermont, we really only see vacation rental management companies thriving around the ski resort towns. And I know you have several there in the Ludlow area. And my slides are being a little slow to advance. So I'm going to throw some numbers at you, but I wanted to first give you a visual of some Vermont short-term rentals. So these are real live listings for rent here in Vermont. And you can see we have a great variety and a big diversity of short-term rentals. I did some research trying to figure out what the most expensive short-term rental was, and it's this one in the top left here. This is I think it's like a 17-bedroom estate in Stowe. It rents for about $9,000 a night. So they get some good tax revenue off that one, but then we also have the typical seasonal lake camp, a small little mother-in-law in somebody's backyard, a renovated castle, the ski condos, of course, yurts, tiny houses, lamp sites, etc. So just wanted to just give you a visual before we look at this number here, which is Vermont data. The data for Vermont right now shows that there are about 11,000, 12,000, thereabouts, it fluctuates daily, active whole home short-term rentals in Vermont. So this number is excluding shared units. So we're not looking at rooms in a house. We're just looking at whole units. And that currently represents about 3% of Vermont's housing stock. Now, in comparison, when you think about our housing stock in general, 17% of it are classified as seasonal or second homes. So there's still a lot of vacant homes out there. And this 3% being used as short-term rental isn't a subset within the 17%. They're independent of each other, and we don't understand the overlap, where they do overlap and where they don't. The other thing we know about short-term rentals here in Vermont, and this information the demographics come from a compilation of research studies, surveys, and kind of insider information from the platform data. But we know that the majority of short-term rentals in Vermont are owned by people who are over the age of 55. About 60% are women-owned or managed. We know that more than half are owned by Vermonters or part-time Vermonters. And when I say part-time, I mean folks who come and live for chunks of time during the year here in Vermont. So say for the ski season or for the summer season, and then either snowboard somewhere else in their preferred off season. We know that most of, and by most of I mean close to 90%, if not more, of the short-term rentals in our market are owned by people who use them personally during the year. And we also know that the majority of them are being offered as monthly furnished rentals in addition to a short-term rental period. And typically they tend to be part of a small real estate portfolio. One of our partners has data for us saying that about 75% of owners in our market are only own one or two short-term rental properties. So there's a big distribution of ownership generally across the state. And this just shows again that short-term rentals so often cross that line between a short-term and a long-term rental unit. And this really demonstrates that point that 80% of our short-term rental inventory is also supplying this furnished monthly rental housing. So where do short-term rentals come from? Okay, so this is where we're getting into territory that we don't know. We don't have data around these points, and I think that's really important to understand and to acknowledge that these are questions that we should and need to have answers to. So typically, short-term rentals fall into 5 different categories. They're a private room or a guest suite within somebody's primary residence. They're a whole home rental of a primary resident. So when you are out of town, you rent out your whole home. They can be the whole home rental of a secondary residence. So your vacation home, when you're not vacationing, you rent it out. They emerge from, a whole home rental of an investment property where the owner never spends any time at the property themselves, and it's 365 days a year offered as a vacation rental. Or they come from the rental of an experiential or non-dwelling space, and so that's that more alternative category. And they have either entered the market in one of 3 ways. Either they were an existing vacant dwelling unit before they were on the short-term rental market, or they were an occupied dwelling unit, or they were a new purpose-built structure or a renovated structure from a previously non-dwelling unit type of structure, such as a barn or a garage or something of that nature. We're seeing a lot of offices now convert into short-term rentals. That was not formerly a residential space or residential use that is now. So what's important about this is the only time that short-term rentals have the opportunity to influence the rental market as a whole is when they meet these 2 criteria. When they are the whole home rental of an investment property that was previously also occupied by a resident. So that's why it's important to know what type of rental it is and how it came into the market. So when we look at the supply of all short-term rentals by type in Vermont, we see this breakdown of homes versus apartments versus alternative versus hotels and private rooms, and they all get lumped together. So when we look at this number, the data that we do have of abundance of short-term rentals, it's all mixed up. It's that $9,000 a night estate weighted equally to the accessory dwelling unit that's in somebody's backyard or as an owner occupied duplex. So really this data, what I guess my point is this data doesn't tell us enough of what we need to know about short-term rentals as it relates to housing impact. So for Ludlow right now, the latest data we have shows 651 whole home short-term rental units in Ludlow as of September. And now again, I think the question for your community is, one, how does that compare to the proportion of total housing units that we have available? And how is that going to change, or what is the makeup of this number in terms of the type of short-term rental, how it came into the market, and how it's changed over time? Sorry, my slides keep getting stuck and then jumping around. So another little bit of information that I have for you, what we do know, thanks to some of our data partners, is that the gross revenue for short-term rentals in Ludlow in 2021 was $9.7 million, and in 2022, $8.9 million. And so when you calculate, and I know I'm pretty sure that this isn't transparent to you as tax revenue, as it's coming into you back to you from the state as local option, but from a calculation standpoint, we estimate that Ludlow, the town of Ludlow, is seeing over $600,000 a year in local option tax revenue just from short-term rental reservation revenue. And that doesn't include the visitor spending. Short-term rental visitors tend to stay longer than hotel visitors, spending about $1,500 during their stay at local businesses and supporting, of course, local jobs. So, regulating short-term rentals, it's really important to consider not just the local community needs, but also the statewide impacts as well. I have this QR code up on the screen. We have a couple of resources that are available to the public that can help provide background and data, but also some guidance, step-by-step guidance on some recommendations or different approaches to creating policy around short-term rentals. But essentially, number one, the first step, and you all seem to be a little bit, you're making progress through this already, but is to really get short-term rental defined in your town bylaws so that you can start identifying and monitoring them. So these are some considerations that I would suggest you think about when you're deciding whether or not or how to regulate short-term rentals. Always start with what is your desired outcome for a policy. We've seen communities push short-term rental regulations forward without having a clear intention in mind or having a clear question that they want answered or outcome that they want to see, and it makes it really, really hard to justify the policy decision or go back and evaluate its effectiveness if you don't have that original desired outcome statement at the beginning. Property rights obviously are a big consideration. There's a really good short-term rental regulation will find a balance between property rights and community impacts. Personal privacy is a big issue. A lot of communities are starting to put in rules around having to provide lock boxes so that police and fire responders can have access to your building. There's a lot of privacy issues around that to consider. Community nuisances, the most common nuisances from short-term rentals across the board are noise, trash, and parking. Most communities already have ordinances around noise, trash, and parking. So one efficiency can be to just ensure that those ordinances are being enforced and upheld and associated with your short-term rental ordinance. Or if you don't have those types of community-wide nuisance ordinances in place, it might be a good opportunity to think about adopting ones. It's important to consider the economic impacts. We don't have a ton of data around the economic impacts. It would take a real comprehensive study to understand all the secondary and tertiary impacts of the industry. So the tax data is really all we have at this moment for hard numbers. Enforcement obviously is really important. There's no sense in putting an ordinance or rules together if they can't be enforced or if they aren't feasibly enforceable. This is a really good opportunity to lean into your short-term rental community because they know how it works and they know what they can and can't do. And they can be a really strong partner to help you understand the practicality and the enforceability of some of the requirements that you'd like to put in. Again, leveraging existing ordinances to help with nuisance control. And then I always recommend considering the parity that your short-term rental ordinance has with long-term rental requirements. Short-term rentals are often the subject of big safety conversations. However, we see that incidents occur far, far less often at short-term rentals than they do at long-term rentals. And especially when it comes to building code compliance, really the safety of any renter, regardless of whether they're staying 1 night, 2 nights, 30 nights, or 300 nights, should be considered equal in terms of ensuring that rental units are safe. Obviously, your administrative resources are important and will affect what you are able to realistically do as a community to manage a short-term rental registry, as well as your state and town resources. So again, thinking a little bit more regionally as to what type of impact this has. This comes up again with fire safety inspections. We see some towns being very narrow in their inspection requirements and safety requirements and tapping into a very small pool of resources, which when all of the communities around each other are doing the same thing and relying on the same 5 people to service their needs, it creates a huge bottleneck and can be problematic. And lastly, the risk of litigation. We are just now starting to see more and more cases and challenges be ruled on across the country. So I will give you a few cautionary tales of some recent lawsuits that have resulted in a court ruling. The first being recently in Austin, Texas, where the city of Austin essentially passed an ordinance banning non-owner occupied short-term rentals, saying that short-term rentals could only operate if there was an owner living on site. The federal court ruled that to be unconstitutional. In Conway, New Hampshire, not too far from us, they also went through a recent litigation where the town sued a property owner because they told them that they were operating a commercial operation in a residential zone. There are multiple, this is not the only ruling that supports this, but that's the closest to home, where the court has ruled that a short-term rental use is not a commercial use, it is a residential use in nature and should be regulated as such. Here in Vermont, this is the only one I could find related to short-term rentals. This was back from 2012, I believe. The Supreme Court ruled that a short-term rental use of a vacation home is not considered a change of use from residential. And my last example is, or cautionary tale is, I guess, that we are actively watching a lawsuit that was just brought to the city of Burlington by a group of short-term rental hosts that believe they are being unduly regulated and restricted by the authority that the city of Burlington is exerting. So that outcome is yet to be determined, and we will be watching that. But I think in general, nobody wants to get mixed up into a lawsuit. And again, we're here to try to help find solutions that avoid any of that pain and wasted energy and resources. So in general, any short-term rental management program that you consider, highly recommend keeping it simple and online with an easy renewal process. The more complicated your ordinance gets, the lower compliance we see. People just aren't going to opt in as easily if it's too difficult and too cumbersome for them to complete. It should be designed so that you're collecting the information that's relevant to the questions that you're trying to answer. It should establish means of communication between the town and the short-term rental managers. It should allow you to distribute educational materials and enforce standards and rules around responsible hosting. And for this, please, come lean on us, come to us. We have developed standards for our members around safety and parking and noise and emergency contacts, etc., to help mitigate any potential conflicts in the neighborhoods between neighbors, and we do encourage communities set up complaint systems so that anybody from the community can identify a problem actor, and we can all work together to resolve or remove that problem host. And then finally, ensuring that you're avoiding burdening the limited resources of local emergency and fire services. And we recommend doing so by leaning on more private sector services and technology that's readily available. So I definitely think starting with the registration program and to monitor your current STR activity without restrictions is the best place to start. This gives you your baseline data and will help you, start with high compliance so that you can do good data collection and monitor for change over time. Applying standards and expectations for responsible hosting as I just said, and focusing on homeowner and community education. A lot of the issues that we hear, the concerns that we hear from local communities are easily can be easily managed and controlled with just more education, better education for folks who are coming into this industry for the first time and aren't the professionally managed properties. So just to end, these are some of my more specific suggestions are which you can also find in our policy guide on our website, but is to permit short-term rentals in all zoning districts where residential uses are allowed. And, you know, we recommend a permit that runs with the owner and not the land. Using a third-party service provider and the technology and software that they have. These are two companies, GovOS and Granicus. Granicus, you know, GovOS is similar and contracted by the city of Rutland and Killington. But this really takes the burden off the town in terms of needing employees to do the work and management. And they use their software to enforce compliance by identifying listings through their software. Safety inspections, you know, a lot of towns are trying to put in an annual safety inspection. This is not in parity with any long-term rental requirements that I have ever seen. Normally, long-term rental safety inspections are one every 5 years, unless there's a specific complaint that's filed. And that, again, is based on how often code changes and how often and how available those resources are to complete those inspections. For the vacation rental industry purposes, a qualified home builder or home inspector would be perfectly qualified to ensure and evaluate whether or not a home is up to Vermont's building codes and could file that same report and a recommendation in case there are violations that need correcting, which wouldn't burden public resources from fire and safety. But then there's also technology out there that allows people to do a do-it-yourself inspection with third-party verification. And so this is something that we encourage all of our members to complete, is this free safety inspection online with your smartphone, taking photos. And it's a process that produces a report and is a great starting point to make sure people are in line with Vermont fire safety code. Occupancy limits, we recommend that these be set to be based on either a certificate of occupancy that's been issued or the number of legal bedrooms, 2 people per bedroom, typically with a little bit of a buffer of +2 people. And then a kind of a 3 strikes you're out penalty program to remove the irresponsible hosts if they are repeatedly in violation of noise or other nuisances. And of course, the penalty should be a civil penalty, not a criminal offense, and could result in the revoking of the permit. So we also have available a complete model ordinance and model short-term rental registration form that I'm happy to share with the select board and anybody who's interested to help, again, get you the data that you need and the ordinance that will really hopefully mitigate any community concerns without inviting unnecessary risk to the community of litigation and lawsuits. And with that, I'm happy to turn it back to you or answer any questions that anybody has.
Great, thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Julie. I think that was, for myself, was very informative. I guess I would open it up if the chair is, Brett, you want to, if anyone has questions for Julie, now would be the time. I don't know if there's anyone on Zoom that has questions.
Do we know if the 3% of the state of Vermont, how does that translate to the percentage of STRs in Ludlow?
They can't hear you.
You got to come to the mic.
Usually too loud. The 3% of STRs based on the statewide data, how is that represented in Ludlow? Do we know that, or would that be a Granicus question?
That would be a question for your town, probably the zoning administrator, whoever counts the number of total units that are available, because that's the way the state calculates it. It's percentage of housing units used as short-term rentals compared to all housing units.
Anybody else?
I see Justin online here.
Hey, Julie, nice to meet you. Great presentation, by the way. Earlier on in the slides, you said the STRs are owned by the owner and then rented, and that number was rather high, I think. How many days quantify if it's owned and used by the owner? You guys have metrics of that?
Right. Yeah. So the statistic is that, or the information that we have is roughly 90% of our short-term rentals in Vermont are used by the owner for personal use at some point during the year. We don't have any more kind of granular definitions around that time. It may be that the owner uses it 1 week out of the year or 5 months out of the year. But that's just information that we get from property management companies telling us about their homeowner clientele, in addition to the vacation rental data analyzers, the databases that Key Data, Transparent, AirDNA, that they see from their sources as to the relationship of ownership, management, and availability on the market. So we don't have any like clearer detail than that. From a federal tax point of view, I think it's 2 weeks. Changes, like they have their own definition for what makes a secondary residency a secondary residency from a federal tax standpoint. I believe that tells the owner that they have to occupy their secondary residence for at least 2 weeks out of a year to be considered a secondary residence from a federal tax perspective.
I'd jump back in here if I.
Go ahead, Justin.
Thanks, Chair. Julie, a lot has happened recently with LLCs and corporations coming in and buying up inventory. Is that reflective within the data? Can you speak on what that looks like?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a misunderstanding, because purchasing a property under an LLC is just pretty much the advice that anybody gets from a financial advisor or a real estate attorney. And that is just for liability protections. A lot of people don't, own their homes under an LLC or under a trust to protect the rest of their assets or their partner's assets. If anything were to happen to them, or if they were to be sued for any reason. So I think that just the general practice of purchasing properties as an LLC is extremely common and advised by most realtors and real estate attorneys these days. So I don't think it's an indicator of, I understand that there's a fear of kind of hedge fund, big business corporations coming and buying up properties. We don't see any evidence of that. But you wouldn't see that just looking at the LLC ownership, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Anybody else with any questions?
I just have a comment.
Yeah.
In case Julie's answer needed some clarity, I can tell you in almost 40 years selling real estate in Ludlow, the numbers of people that you see register their homes either at time of transfer or even after as into an LLC at the advice of their financial counsel is very, very prevalent. And even for people that have no intention of renting. If they have a housekeeper that gets hurt or someone falls on their property, they stand to lose everything if it's a really bad accident. So there's no, it's just a long time practice with, even for people that don't want to rent, so.
Oh, there are some hands up.
It looks like Andy Goldman.
Andrea?
Thank you. Great presentation. Thank you so much, Julie. Question, do you know what percent, and I'm sorry if I missed these and you stated it, do you know what percent of Vermont towns or municipalities have short-term rental registries or are currently considering them? And do you know, for those that do, what the average annual cost is to the short-term rental owner or permit, whatever that is, for annually? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we attempt to try to track all of the different communities that are discussing short-term rental registration and where they are in that process. It would make for a really great graduate student project if anybody knows a grad student or any student who needs a project or an internship. Unfortunately, our data is a little bit incomplete and outdated, but there are at least 24 communities in Vermont who are actively discussing this in their planning commission or in their select board. Probably, a lesser amount that's actually enacted, but still several towns. I think the challenge is, especially for, from our perspective, from an industry perspective, is that this is all starting to become very patchwork and inconsistent. And so communities are coming up with very different ways in which to deal with this. And it's becoming really inefficient for towns as well. So, as an association, we really encourage a more statewide approach to a rental registry because the economic efficiency of paying for a service to do that would be a lot more efficient for everybody if we could get a statewide account rather than have a small community, try to cover that cost with a lot fewer taxpayers to support it. So we see it range all over the maps. Some communities are charging, a couple $1,000s depending on the size of the house for a annual rental registration, and others are able to only charge homeowners maybe $100, $150 for the annual registration. And, there's been lots of discussions. I know Stowe is discussing kind of what the balance is too for that, because you don't want to make it so burdensome where you're going to have a problem with compliance because people can't just reasonably continue to afford all these added fees and costs to them, and so they'll try to avoid it for as long as possible. So there's no really right answer. I think I would look at, again, the revenue that comes in from the industry to the town to help supplement the cost of an enforcement service, or kind of back calculate what each rental would need to contribute in order to cover the cost of a registration program.
Got it. Thank you. And just as a follow-up, Sue, you had mentioned about the local option tax. And well, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have one. But if we did 1% instead of the registry, then the village and town combined, it sounds like, could make $90,000 a year based on the $9 million figures that you had mentioned earlier. Would that be correct?
Based on my calculation, please somebody check my math. I do not claim to be good at math, but if Ludlow doesn't have the 1% local option tax on meals and rooms, that would definitely be something to consider adopting and proposing to the voters, because with $9 million coming in every year from short-term rental reservations, I think my calculations was more of the town would see about $600,000 a year in additional revenue.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Who's the other one up there?
Graham Dempster. And Andy's hand just went down.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Graham Dempster. I'm the director for the host compliance team at Granicus. I just want to say what Julie has put forward in terms of, smart recommendations when considering ordinances is directly in line with what we talk to all of our customers about. To give some context around some of the numbers, just looking at the data for your jurisdiction, there's only about 14 active short-term rentals that are owned by LLCs. That is out of the total market of 732 active short-term rental units. And then just to build on the last comment from Andy, typically what we see jurisdictions do is look at the median nightly rate, which in Ludlow is about $500 a night, and looking at 2 times the nightly rate for a registration fee requirement.
Right, and that's definitely the sliding scale type of registration fee is certainly much easier to implement when you have the software capacity of the service providers, for sure. If you were going to try to do kind of an in-house registration process, that would be very difficult to do, and then you would probably want to set just a flat fee.
Julie, I had a question for you. Our planning commission has talked about short-term rentals, and we've debated about whether to require people to have home insurance or not. Is that something your organization requires or recommends?
Thanks for that question. It is something that we recommend. I would caution requiring any specific type of insurance. Insurance is kind of a personal liability decision. We do recommend that hosts get the appropriate type of insurance to cover the activity that they're doing. There are commercial policies that are designated just for short-term rental activity. They can be rather expensive, even though they are the most comprehensive. But then more and more just regular homeowner insurance providers are coming out with short-term rental endorsements or add-ons to policies. So there's a number of ways that people can add on extra protections, but I would be cautious around requiring an insurance, but rather than strongly recommending and pointing people to the best options out there.
Go ahead.
Please state your name.
Allie Madeira. Hey, Julie. I was wondering if you can point to any towns that you've seen do a registry really well. I know you're talking to a lot, but have seen it working well and isn't putting too much of a local burden on, local resources.
Yeah, Sally. Right now, just given where the state is in this process, Killington, I think, is the best example, just because they've been doing it the longest. So we actually they're the only community that I'm aware of that actually has a few years of data and history and experience now running with this type of registration program. And it seems to be doing really well. And if you call up the zoning administrator, Jim, there, tell him I sent you, and he'll give me a hard time next time he sees me.
Hi there. I came to the meeting that you had in Ludlow before, so it's really good to hear you again. Picked up all the information I didn't get then. Can you speak a bit more to the lawsuits, specifically the one about privacy and what the specific privacy issues were? And I think the other one spoke to property rights. And I also, within the last 6 months, I had read about a case, I think it was in Louisiana, where the municipality was intending to restrict short-term rentals in a certain district in town, and the federal court ruled that the municipality did not have the authority to tell the homeowner how many days out of the year they could or could not rent their property. Thanks.
Yeah, so the lawsuits that I mentioned were from Austin, Texas, Conway, New Hampshire, and Grand Isle, Vermont. The first had to do with owner occupancy requirements, and in that case, the federal court ruled that preventing a non-resident from renting their vacation home was unconstitutional and violated a commerce clause within the Constitution. I'm not a lawyer, but that is my understanding of that case. The North Conway one was about whether or not a short-term rental use was a residential or commercial use, and that court found short-term rentals to be a residential use, not a commercial. And then the Vermont case was about whether or not the renting of a vacation home would require the homeowner to file a change of use with the town, and the court ruled that it would not. There wasn't anything about privacy, unless I misspoke, and if I did, I apologize. The Louisiana case I have heard of in New Orleans, that is another recent example, where the courts ruled in favor of the homeowner in an ordinance that was overreaching in their zoning restrictions for this type of use.
Eric Alden, Trailside Road. Good evening, Julie. Nice to see you. Julie and I chat regularly. She's a great resource for this stuff. This question may be more for Granicus. I'm curious if the data's been drilled down on specifically to compile a look at ski towns or resort towns that have a great influx of visitors over a 2 or 3 month period, as opposed to the data that's collected for the entire year.
So specifically for Ludlow, we do see an influx as we get into kind of the early September range in terms of people advertising their property. We've only been capturing this information for about a year now, so we haven't drilled down into anything specific for the town. I can speak to some of our other work with Colorado ski towns and how they see the short-term rentals impacting their local market. If you look at Summit County, which is the Breckenridge ski area, they've had regulations for a long time. They've updated their regulations probably 3 times, and all of that is due to having the information about the short-term rental market. And as Julie touched on, it is still evolving. And so initial regulations that were put forth 5, 6, 7 years ago may no longer apply to the changing market. And we do see that ski towns tend to be more impacted by short-term rentals than your typical beach town or other tourist type destination.
Yeah, and I guess I want to add, sorry for the messy slide sharing, but I just want to add, this data is also publicly available through housingdata.org, and when you scroll over the lines here, it will pop up with some more information for you. But this is the summer. The valleys here for Ludlow are the summer months. So in some communities we see the reverse trends where short-term rental activity peaks in the summer and drops significantly in the winter. In your community, we see the peaks in the winter and the valleys in the summer. Obviously, this is an exaggerated valley from the flooding this summer. And then you can see the COVID drop as well. That helps to answer your question too, Eric.
Eric, go ahead.
Thanks, Julie. Another question. I'm wondering if the data shows specifically to Ludlow here. If we can determine out of those 651 short-term rentals, what happens to those for the rest of the year? Are they ever available for a 6-month rental or a 9-month rental and then not for the winter? Is there any breakdown on the data that way to show, do they just sit empty for the year? The point I guess I'm trying to make is if there was some stringent regulations, or if they were banned outright, would that somehow magically create a great influx of housing in the town?
I'll let Graham comment too, but I mean, what we see is that generally regulations that attempt to remove short-term rentals from the market do not result in new long-term rentals coming online in terms of annual leases. They may convert to monthly furnished rentals, but most of them already do operate in that way in conjunction with short-term rental offerings as well. The other reason why we don't typically see a huge correlation is because just the nature of a typical vacation rental is not aligned with the housing needs that Vermont has right now, which are affordable by definition related to income, so lower income and smaller, typically one bedrooms or 2 bedrooms. The average vacation rental is 3 or 4 bedrooms and generally valued above affordability needs of a lower income household or individual.
That said, with the data, you do have the ability to kind of look at when listings were taken down. We do see that even though a listing may be active during certain periods of the year, they may have their calendar blocked. They're not accepting reservations. So it's still listed as a short-term rental property, but they may not be accepting any new guests during certain periods of the year. And that is exactly in line with what Julie mentioned. Could be secondary homeowners that are planning to use their property for a period of time, or whether they have individuals that want to book longer stays during the down periods.
Yeah, and I would point to, if you want to do some reading, both the town of Waterbury and the town of Manchester did a deeper dive into their short-term rental community, and Waterbury especially did put in the effort knocking door to door to answer those questions about each short-term rental listing that they found. Granted, they started with a much smaller pool than Ludlow, so if Ludlow tried to do that, it would be a much bigger project. But essentially what they ended up finding was that it was such a small percentage of all the short-term rentals that were listed that were really eligible to return to the long-term rental market, that they didn't decide to move forward with any type of registration or regulation because it wasn't going to have the impact that they were looking for.
So the only comment I had to that was what a lot of discussions end up being, is if someone is going to, if they own a property, another option if they're not going to do a short term here, and they can just do what we call a seasonal rental. So that's where we're all familiar. People will essentially have a 5-month lease from the beginning of middle of April to the middle of, or sorry, from the middle of November to the middle of April when the mountain is open and closed, and they come and go as they see fit throughout those 5 months, having paid all their money up front and being responsible for utilities usually. So for owners, that's another option possibly before they move to a complete change of type of ownership. And what we're seeing a little bit too is owners do go that route from time to time, and they'll even carve out space or time for themselves. They might take a week here, week here, week here, and we find, or someone finds the right renter that matches up, and they're essentially sharing that space. So I just want to offer that up as another alternative that's out there.
Right, which is why it is such a nuanced industry. It makes answering questions like that specifically challenging.
Justin.
Thank you, Chair. During the presentation, Julie, we had from September 23, 2023, the 651. Graham, you mentioned Ludlow had a different number. What number was that?
So the current, this is as of today, is 732.
Does that include shared rooms?
This is total short-term rental units, so physical properties. In terms of the market breakdown, about 97% are entire home rentals, and 2.5% are partial homes. So those would be those owner-occupied stays.
And Julie, I had one more question for you. I have read a little bit about Montpelier, Stowe, and Manchester, and you just mentioning Manchester reminded me. What is the status with those 3 towns?
Yeah, so one comment first back to the data. Again, the data is imperfect, and the numbers, there's definitely a margin of error in the numbers depending on which data source you use. So the way in which Granicus calculates and finds listings is different from the way that AirDNA collects data from scraping internet listings, which is different from the way that Key Data and Transparent collect their data, which pulls from PMS software. So they're all going to be a little bit different. Granicus's data is probably a little bit more accurate than the AirDNA data, which is what the Vermont Housing Finance Agency purchases and puts out there for us to use. So those numbers being that close, I think is pretty confident, can give us pretty confidence, but I wouldn't expect them to be one for one, just given the integrity of the data that's out there. What's going on in Stowe, Montpelier, and Manchester? Manchester just passed an ordinance after they completed a short-term rental impact study. So the residents are digesting that. Stowe is still in the middle of conversations. They have done an extensive public comment, public discussion period since the beginning of this year on this topic. And I imagine that they will come to some form of decision for a next step in the near future, but I have yet to see what that is. I anticipate that they will take a light touch approach and just focus on gathering data for now and trying to identify and establish communication lines with short-term rental operators. Montpelier is a little bit less known to me at this point in time. I know there were discussions happening at the housing committee level, and I have to admit I haven't kept up with the status of their discussions as of late.
Thank you. And Chair, I believe our Planning Commission did conduct a survey. Is that correct?
Terry?
So is a requirement of our grant that we had through the Regional Planning Commission, we had to conduct a survey to see our community's viewpoints in the village, and we sent a postcard giving people a link to the survey to every single village person on the checklist. And out of those people, we got 297 responses, but we also had it on the website, so you could also participate that way. And then you were aggregated by whether you actually lived in the village, or if you were a full-time resident, or if you were a visitor. There were different, categories you could go into. Of the 297 responses on the short-term rental questions we asked, the effect on the community, 50% of the people thought short-term rentals had a negative effect on our community, and 20% thought they had a positive effect. 60% wanted a registry in town, and 20% said no. And 80% wanted a yearly fee, and 10% said no. And any revenue that was generated from short-term rentals, the overwhelming place they wanted it to go was housing. That was number one. And number two was public safety. And that was the data I wanted to share with you guys about that survey. We went to the village trustees first to get permission, and they saw the questions we were going to ask and okayed those.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, just a minute. Steve, go ahead.
I feel like, I talk to a lot of people in town, and I feel like a lot of people think that the short-term rentals, I have no skin in the game, I don't have a short-term rental, but a lot of people think that that's why there's no affordable housing in Ludlow. And I think that, although the citizens of the village, I'm one of them, think that it might be, the numbers stated by the expert says that it doesn't turn, like getting rid of the STRs is not going to bring back long-term rentals. So I just think that needs to be taken into account as a fact. Like, I know a lot of people that own, half their house is an Airbnb and half their house is their ski rental, and without that, they couldn't afford that house. So in my opinion, what's going on around here is and always has been, a ton of giant houses that don't need to be rented because those people are so rich. And if we get rid of the blue collar, half the people that are barely getting by with Airbnb, you could end up with more empty houses and not fix the problem as well. And it seems like we're losing $700,000 in revenue for the town at the same time.
Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Could you state your name, please?
But I had a couple questions. I would like to say that as a short-term rental owner, I would not ever rent long-term. I would leave my house empty for sure. I just do this for, it's like a retirement project. It helps keep the house in good condition. I think a house is like a living, breathing thing in that if left unlived in, it becomes actually in danger, of breaking down. Having the heat on, running the water, etc., on a regular basis keeps the house in much better shape. So that's a very big reason for why I do it. It helps. I don't get that monthly or nightly rate that was quoted by Granicus. And also, I would like to know, and I think I've asked Julie this in the past, and it was something that was curious to me. There are a number of homes or houses in Ludlow on Pleasant Street, etc., that are ski clubs. What category does the ski club fall into? And would it also be regulated? Because I'm sure people come and go in the club. They're all different and they have numbers of cars, etc. And, it's just, are they a separate category? Are they included in this? And finally, I'd like to say that I have been waiting and attended several meetings for short-term rentals. I'm waiting to hear what the substantive data is that supports the need for regulation. How many ambulance calls, how many police calls, how many noise complaints, how many nuisance complaints have been generated that make you believe that the regulatory process will help or address things? Because if you don't have the data to support that, you're taxing us for something that's a solution in search of a problem. That's it.
Can we get your name?
Yes, my name is Astrid, Astrid Lehman, Lehmann.
Okay, thank you.
I thought it would come up on the screen. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks, Astrid. I think the issue of the ski houses is an interesting one to me and something that I personally wasn't familiar with. I suspect that they may fall under a different classification. I'd have to do some digging in the Vermont statute. It may depend on the financial structure of, they may not be paying to rent that space. I'm not sure, but I have a suspicion that they would fall under a different category.
What we've seen in other ski communities is with any of those resort type properties, they tend to be zoned differently. And in a lot of ski communities, those properties tend to be exempt from specific short-term rental regulation. It's more applicable to other zones like residential. That said, there are communities that do have timeshares, and those tend to be subject to the state law, and whether or not those can be considered short-term rentals or not, to Julie's point, is really going to depend on how those properties can be classified and whether they can be subject to the same regulations as a short-term rental in a residential property, for example.
Glenn Height-Smith, 112, Route 103 South. Grumman, Sikorsky, Norwalk Ski Club. Okay, that's what we're talking about, and I don't think you addressed that.
There's Manchester also.
Manchester. And so where do they fall in this? But just a clarification on Steve Meyer's point, which was, is there a correlation between short-term rentals and so-called workforce housing? Or lack thereof.
Again, we don't see evidence of that. And believe me, I I know we have a housing issue here in Vermont. We have a housing shortage, and we have for a very long time. And we don't claim to be the experts on housing. We talk to the affordable housing experts in our community and at our state, and we follow their lead. And if vacation rentals were pointed as being a significant problem, we would be out there trying to be part of the solution. But that's just not what the data shows us right now, and not what the population trends tell us is that's what's needed. So, I think the best way that the short-term rental industry and community can support the development of new housing and new affordable housing is, we take a position that supports increasing economic development opportunities, increasing zoning density in downtowns for smart growth development, increasing wages so people can afford rent and home prices. What we do see, what the national economic studies do show, is that income actually tends to be the greatest influencer of housing market prices. And we've seen that in Vermont happen very recently, where a lot of higher income households are moving to our state, and essentially the affordability factor doesn't apply to them, and that has really shifted the entire market. But that's because they have the incomes from a different, the out-of-state incomes that are much higher than our in-state incomes.
And there have been some very creative regulations and incentives in certain ski areas. If you look at Durango, there are incentives for short-term rental operators with large properties to build ADUs or adjacent dwelling units focused specifically on workforce housing. That is one example. There are other communities across the country. I know some in Florida and some in Arizona that have actually put forward incentive packages for short-term rental operators to convert back to more longer-term stays. Those tend to be some of the more new policies that we've seen come forward across the country, but there are ways that you can leverage the short-term rental market to build some workforce housing.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that to say we have seen some communities try to incentivize homeowners to rent long-term by offering them financial stipends. Those have largely been ineffective just because what's been offered hasn't been enough to entice people to become a landlord when they never wanted to be. So to varying degrees, there have been different attempts. I think that one of the newest things we're starting to see is people talk about tax incentives for providing annual rental properties, huge subsidies and huge tax breaks for property owners who are offering long-term meaning annual unfurnished rental units. Because to Graham's point, in general, if you look at the short-term rental community, they may or may not already be involved in the housing community as well. Some early polling that we did showed that about 20% of the short-term rental community also operate as housing providers around the state and have a larger rental portfolio that includes long-term offerings. So there are resources in this community, and a lot of people do diversify their portfolios. But I personally would love to see more incentives for people to get into the long-term housing market as a viable occupation. I think that is what we need to bring people into that industry, because it's just, whether or not housing is a human right, and it absolutely should be, if it's a private sector commodity, it will only operate under the guise of capitalism and making money.
Eric.
Thank you. Eric Alden, Trailside Road. There's been a lot of discussion about this, and I think what it really boils down to, and it's a point that was emphasized on one of Julie's slides, is what is your goal here? Like, what do you want to achieve? What do the boards want to achieve here? And I'm not sure that's been put on record on what you want to achieve and what your goal is. I think you need to have your goal and then work backwards from there. Thank you.
Brian?
Ryan Silvestri. So just to piggyback off of Eric, so I was on the short-term rental committee when they first started, and this all started for health safety, fire safety, and occupancy and education. So regulation was really never spoken of at the, when all this started. So to me, that was a tangible goal, and it was a goal that I feel is needed, especially with occupancy and some of the health and fire safety issues I see while inspecting property as a town assessor. So, that's something that I know is real. It's hard for others to see, without combing the internet, but, you go through enough short-term rental photos and you see single bedrooms with 4 or 5 bunk beds. You see occupancy rates in the 30s, and what we have is a 3 or 4 bedroom house. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up and point us back to where I thought the original motivation was for this. And I would definitely like to hear from the board and any of your opinions or questions and where you feel we should go with this. Thank you.
Okay, far as I'm concerned, for the chair, public safety is probably my #1 priority for this purpose. I served 35 years on the fire department. To go into these places and not have them managed and pile people in, I've been waiting for the day that we're gonna go in and just not recoup people. It puts an impact on life safety. It puts an impact on resources of the property. I mean, septics, they're overloading septics, they're overloading water usage. That is probably the biggest goal I see myself for. So I don't know whether anybody else is. Oh, Suzanne.
Yeah, so I was also part of that committee that did a lot of great work and a lot of great discussion. And safety does seem to be something that everyone can get around, come around. Where I would like to see, having, again, gone into different places, whether they be primary homes, apartments, employee housing, short-term rentals, primary homes, but we're talking about rentals here. So what I walk into on a fairly regular basis are rental properties in general that need inspection and need to be safe, not just short term. So as a community, getting around safety, I think is like, no one could argue with that, but to just look at short-term rental safety doesn't make a lot of sense to me when there are children living in this town in places that don't have smoke alarms, that don't have updated smoke alarms. I have not understood where we draw the line between it's okay for long-term housing not to be safe, but short-term housing has to be monitored and safer.
Anybody else? Anybody else have any comments or questions? I guess, where do we want to move forward from here? Brendan?
Well, I think there was some very good discussion tonight, and for myself, all those points are very well taken. I think for this board, I'd agree with what was just recently said, is that the board, myself, the goal needs to be established as to what we want out of this. So I would think that we need to look at that and probably discuss it in our January meeting and continue to move forward there. I'll have some proposals. But I think that's really, we need to keep working on this and not, and again, January would be our next meeting, and continue this discussion. And by that point, maybe have an idea of exactly what our goal is, what is our main focus of where we want to end this discussion and how we want to come out of it. So that would be my recommendation, is that we have this discussion continued at our January Select Board meeting.
Eric?
Eric Alden, Shellside Road. All due respect, Brendan, this has been discussed a lot, so I would move that you discuss your goal tonight and decide what that goal is. That's what we're here for, a short-term rental meeting.
Steve?
Just 2 quick points. Like, obviously, there's abuses in hotel rooms. Sometimes you stuff 12 people in there. But like Julie said, capitalism is going to fix the market, essentially. If you have a terrible rental, your reviews are going to make that rental no longer viable. So I think that's self-fixing. And then for me, as a property owner, it's a slippery slope to start telling people what they can do with their properties, and especially with the bedrooms in their house, in my opinion. Because once rights go one way, they're never coming back, whether we did it on purpose or as a bad idea. But to me, it's troublesome to me and to a lot of other property owners being told what we can and can't do with our houses. Houses are given COs. They're routinely assessed by Ryan, and violations will come up. Renters aren't going to rent something that's terrible repeatedly, especially on a platform like Airbnb where it's so review-based. I just wanted to say that my property rights mean a lot to me. So, and I think a lot of other people probably do as well. I just, it's tough. It's a tough situation, but telling someone what they can't do in their house with their bedrooms is a slippery slope to me.
Glenn Heightsmith, still 112 Route 103 South. In the former occupation I had, which was as an innkeeper, once a year I saw the State of Vermont health officer, who charged me most recently about $450 for the inspection that certified that my rooms are clean, that the toilets work, that the beds were made right, and there are no, insect infestations and things like that. So I don't think we can compare short-term rentals directly to, lodging. If it's not going to meet that kind of standard, if we're not going to call for something like that.
Justin?
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to reiterate both Eric Alden and Mr. Silvestri. They both served on the Rental Registry Committee. That committee was commissioned per recommendation of the Select Board over a year and a half ago, with the express goal of figuring out, was it viable to initiate a rental registry? That committee found that it was, based upon safety parameters and the reasons that Mr. Silvestri and Mr. Alden have spoken about tonight. There's been a lot of discussion post that and a lot of misinformation, and I think at the end of the day, this is about safety. And Mr. Silvestri or the town manager might be able to correct me, but his long-term rentals in this town are very, very small, and they're already supposed to be regulated by the Vermont Department of Health and the safety services of the Life Safety Department. Is that correct?
It is.
Yeah.
So, Justin, with talking with the fire marshals, they're basically aimed by complaints or by issues. So if there are no complaints and no issues, they're not looking at properties. So typically on long-term rentals, you aren't going to have any complaints or issues that are brought or bubble to the surface unless something happens. But yeah, to reiterate, yeah, it's been 18 months since we started that committee, and we're really just been looking for guidance and an aim from the select board at this point.
And Mr. Dempster from Granicus, how hard or possible would it be to incorporate LTRs into the software that Granicus provides for the town?
From a registration standpoint, it would be pretty simple. From like a monitoring basis, it typically depends. Long-term rental sites tend to be very differently structured than short-term rental sites in terms of the information provided. And they tend to be on platforms that are a little bit more one-to-one. So me communicating with the owner of that property versus being listed on an online platform. So we tend to avoid monitoring for long-term rentals. That said, if they are advertised on any of the traditionally short-term rental platforms, we do capture that data.
I believe it is our duty as the town leaders here tonight at the Select Board and the Village Trustees to safeguard our community, our town government, and everybody within our borders, and make it as safe as possible for people and as accessible as possible for people to visit this community.
We had these discussions on the Planning Commission about short-term rentals and including long-term rentals, and our consultants from regional said the state of Vermont passed a law this year that you cannot regulate long-term rentals because we don't have any, and they want to encourage them. And so they put a blanket thing out there that towns cannot regulate their long-term rentals.
Noah Schmidt. I do think safety is a huge thing, and we're not creating anything new. It's ensuring that people are following the rules that are currently in place through the state of Vermont. I run a vacation rental management company. Every one of my owners goes through that inspection. I have not once gone through there with a fire marshal and gotten the A-OK on round one. So most places are not up to code from the get-go. Majority of people are ready to do it. They want to be safe, follow the rules. I've had 3 people this year that wanted to work with me, and they did not want to come up to compliance. There are rental management companies that are knowingly not living up to Vermont Fire Code, over occupancy or certain things like that. Also, I live in an apartment on Pleasant Street that was renovated, and they made new apartments and did not file a town permit nor a state permit. And if the flood hadn't happened, we would not be up to code with fire alarms and basic safety. So I do think it is it's something that is faced by both long-term and short-term things. I think the vast majority of people do want to be up to compliance and be safe, and education would be a huge part of that.
Anybody else? Eric.
This is for Glenn. Just per the rules, you're supposed to give your name and address every time you step up here. Eric Alden, Trailside Road. I think if the goal is safety, a dedicated short-term rental registry doesn't fit that need. Because certainly the long-term rentals are, I think most would agree, probably more concerning than short-term rentals. So if you're looking for safety as your basis for a short-term rental, I think you're missing a good piece of the market that really needs the attention.
I hear what everybody's everybody's saying about the long-term rentals. Sorry, Chair, to just jump in here. I hear what everybody's saying about the long-term rentals, and sorry, Chair, to just jump in here. But just because long-term rentals aren't regulated or aren't enforced properly doesn't mean we should just look away from short-term rentals and say, well, the problem's really there, not here too. We should try to incorporate all of it in a common sense, no nonsense way.
Different types of properties not in compliance with septic permits or fire safety codes. And if it's really all about safety, I don't think that it's fair to just single out short-term rentals. And I agree with what Mr. Alden said. I don't see how having Granicus scraping everyone's data every 3 days, 30% of the homeowners in this town is going to fix the safety. You might gather some data, a little bit out of it, but what about all the huge homes up on the mountain? How do you know how many people are in those homes, even though they're not on a rental registry, or they don't rent their home short term? They could be having 30-person parties up there too, on septic systems. So if it's really about safety and the environment, I don't think just singling out short-term rentals is a good idea, if that's really what you're after here. And I don't see any good reason why we would. How much is it going to cost? $40,000 a year to have them scraping short-term rental data every 3 days. When, you know, maybe we could hire someone, have a real person in town who might need a good job. If you do the options tax, there'll be plenty of money to get a full-time person to do permitting. I'm not against permitting. I'm not against an options tax. To make sure that people are, you know, that you know where they are, where these short-term rentals are. That's important. But to have an AI surveillance company targeting short-term rentals for safety doesn't make sense to me. I'd rather see a local person here have a full-time job running the permits, taking phone calls for complaints. You will find the people that are breaking the rules, but to surveil everybody, to find a small percentage of people who are breaking the rules, you know, has some privacy implications in my view. I don't think that's right.
Anyone else?
Glenn Heightsmith, 112 Route 103 South. So, with respect to the town manager, are you guys going to kick this down the road, this can down the road another month, or are you going to sit here and say, well, you know, let's make a decision and let's do something, whatever that may be?
Okay. Justin?
I believe this meeting was to do a public forum to hear from the citizens.
Justin?
I believe this meeting was to do a public forum to hear from the citizens on whether or not to move forward with this. I don't believe this meeting was set up to make any final decisions. I could be wrong in that, but that's the thought.
I think a big portion of this was we had the nice presentation tonight with some information. I think most of us took some pretty serious notes to kind of sit on for a minute to add that to all the extra information that we've already had. I don't think anyone here on the board wants to go into this making a decision that is half-hearted or we don't know all the implications of any decision we make. I think it's been pretty clear from the start that we have looked mostly at safety as probably 95% of why we're trying to do this. I do hear the concerns, but I think it was voiced by Justin that just because we can't grab 100% of the market share at the first swipe doesn't mean that we shouldn't start. We can't ever get to the end getting 100% compliance and having safety for everyone if we don't start somewhere. At least in my eyes, that this was a bunch of really good information that we can look at to try to formulate a plan whichever direction we go. Thank you.
Steve Myers, 81 Andover Street. Would this be decided by y'all, or would this go to a town vote? I guess I would just like to know that.
It can go either way.
Yeah, I guess.
Julie has her hand up.
I just wanted to say that I will provide my slides and some additional information to the board for you to publish on the website, and so that everybody can review and have a copy of that.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So, I guess, go ahead.
I think that what George was saying about, you just heard a presentation, you heard maybe some in-depth information that you haven't heard before, that many of us haven't heard before. We've heard Julie speak. We've been a member of her organization for a few years now, and it's been very educational for me. And so I think just sitting on what you heard tonight makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to correct myself. I wasn't on the committee for the task force there for the rental committee. I monitored it closely, and I went to the majority of the meetings, so I didn't mean to misspeak. But I did hear a lot of conversation. It's a very complicated issue. It's very, very, very complicated. And I think Julie's presentation, if you can remember to, I think a lot of the comments afterwards may help us forget some of the substance of Julie's presentation.
I just got one more question. Just a question for the gentleman from Granicus is, and you briefly stated what the average median nightly rate for Ludlow was. Could you just say that again?
Absolutely. The median nightly rate across all the short-term rental listings is currently $508 a night.
Thank you.
Excuse me, did you just say across the state or in Ludlow?
Ludlow, all the listings.
Okay.
One more point. Selectman Bates had asked for a report on the Granicus. Taxpayers have paid $40,000, $28,000, whatever it is. Is there any kind of printed report out there, or is this it?
That is something that I can say that I've been asked for more than once. And in all honesty, I believe we can get a report, and the data's, I'm just not that familiar with the way the system works in all transparency. I'm jumping into the short-term stuff, but in all honesty, I've looked at the system, started to review it, but have not jumped into to print out the full details of those reports. I'm sure we could get them, but again, to your point, then it's $37K. So what comes out of that, we should have, and I'm sure we can generate it. If I were to sit down in front of my computer right now, I have not been able to do it. Let's put it that way.
Lynn.
I'd like to ask the gentleman from Granicus about the data that you collect. Do you collect more from inside of the face of a listing on Airbnb that a member of the public would see? Do you have an agreement with Airbnb where they give you data that's not available to the public that you're sharing and collecting?
No, all the data we capture is publicly available information.
So there's nothing behind that page that you have an arrangement with Airbnb that you pay for data that's not available on those pages?
Correct. We're not a partner of Airbnb or any of the listing platforms. We don't receive any special information from the listing sites.
Do you buy data from them on individual rentals?
No, absolutely not.
Okay. I've asked before for a list of I believe it's over 250 data points on each individual listing that you scrape every 3 days. I've asked the town for that. I've asked you guys for that. How can I get a copy of that so that I know, as a short-term rental owner, what kind of data you're collecting? And I'd also like to know, is there any way for me to consent to you collecting my data? Do I need to, is there, anyway, I guess I'd like the list first, and then I'll compare it to what's publicly available to see if there's data on there that is not publicly available. So if you could get me the list, I'd appreciate that.
We collect 150 data points related to short-term rentals within a given jurisdiction. When we're contracted with a government, they can incorporate some of their data with the short-term rental data that we're capturing, and the totality of it is what it makes up that 150 different data points. The town has access to be able to provide you that information. If they were to direct us to provide you that information, that is something we would do, but it's not something that we disclose without consent of who we're contracted with to provide that freely to the public.
Okay. I'd like to ask the board for a copy of that on the record.
Can do that.
And you can help them get it if Brendan is having a hard time getting the data off the website. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question. She said that it's 350 points. She's repeated that a couple times. He just said 150, which is it, please, for the record?
The last time Granicus was here, they told me, because I asked specifically, it was a different representative, 250 data points.
Now you just said 250.
No, I don't think I said 350 unless, I might have made a mistake. I meant 250 is what I recall them saying. I'm sorry, last time.
I'm just trying to get the right numbers here.
I just wanted to share that the Planning Commission has discussed short-term rentals. We got stuck on a couple points, but we'd love to share that information with the boards. We looked at Plymouths, Chesters, Killingtons, Woodstocks, Windhalls. There were a lot of other ones in the process, but those were the only ones that had completed it when we started work on it. And really the only 2 points we hadn't gotten to is to present a proposal to both boards was whether they require insurance or not. We had a debate about that, and we hadn't resolved that yet. And what the fee would be. But I just wanted to point out that one of the things that she pointed out as a good example was Killington, and they have, their information is if you rent for less than 14 days, if you rent for more than 14 days, you have to have, less than 14 days, you have to have a permit. How many days? There's still a 30 number. The owner has to be available by phone at all times. Occupancy 2 per bedroom and 2 more allowed. Fees, everyone pays by November 15th. 1 to 2 bedroom, $400. 3 bedroom, $450. 4 bedrooms, $500. Zoning areas allowed in all areas. They do require knock boxes. Parking requirements are on-site only. They don't require insurance, proof of insurance. They do require a state fire inspection if it's more than 8 people that are going to be in your short-term rental. So I just wanted to point that out since she said that was an example of somebody that didn't right.
Thanks.
I do too. One of the things I want to point out about that makes so much sense to me is you're relying on systems that are already in place. So you can self-certify with the Vermont Department of Fire and Safety up to 8 people in your home. So if you're going to sleep 8, no more than 8, then you can self-certify with an online form. It's been available for a number of years. The information is not readily out there to the public, which again, the education piece is important. So what's nice about that is you're taking some of the administrative piece away. So if somebody is going to, they only have to register if it's over 8?
No, they all have to register.
They all have to register fire and safety. Right, which is aligned with the fire and safety rule. So you can self-certify up to 8, and then after that, you have to have fire and safety go into the property. So what's nice about that is that you're already following what's in place.
Justin?
Question for Mr. Dempster or maybe Mr. McNamara. Correct me if I'm wrong, the price last year was 26 or 28,000. And did it go up to 37 this year, or is it still at 26 or 20?
You're correct. The price is still 26.
Thank you.
So I think we're all set. We're going to digest this and come back to January's meeting. And
If you have room for one more.
go ahead.
What's his name?
My name's Stephen Box. I keep hearing repeatedly a reference to purpose. And I think this is a good time for us to consider that maybe we could look at other communities to see what they've come up with as far as purpose. For example, Big Bear Lake has a really interesting ordinance that talks about supporting the local tourism industry, supporting the local economy, as well as supporting the tourists themselves that come to visit, and that would be along the lines of safety, which has come up a lot tonight. But the interesting thing about safety in short-term rentals is that the inspectors and that have been mentioned come from the fire department and inspect from the fire department's perspective, which is awesome. But it only accounts for 3% of the claims that tend to come out of short-term rentals with regards to safety. So who's inspecting for the other 97%? If you look at the Granicus website, their top 5 recommendations for safety are all fire-related, which doesn't address the 97% of the claims that are going to come out of short-term rental injuries or claims, which then brings me to my point, which is this. If indeed we're going to be pursuing safety, or even going so far as to have a vision for supporting the local economy and the local tourism industry and the tourists themselves that come to town, then I think that we should look bigger about not just regulating or legislating, but instead empowering. And I think this is one of the things that Julie may have touched on. I don't know if she did at the beginning of her presentation, but the local short-term rental industry is pretty busy lifting themselves up by participating in education. For example, from world leaders in short-term rental safety like Justin Ford, or as a community in terms of renting responsibly by participating in a group aptly known as Renting Responsibly. But there's so many things that we could do to empower the community as opposed to just levying regulations, which don't do much to lift this up. It was interesting, the guy earlier mentioned new clients that get inspected for the first time and they fail. And one of the reasons that happens is because I was inspected 7 times in 1 week 2 weeks ago. I never see an inspector with a checklist, nor do I get a checklist in advance. I was inspected by federal, state, and local different agencies and authorities. But the point is they all show up and I've got to try and understand what they're going to be looking for. And that's the thing. If we just empower and inform and educate, you'll end up with a qualified short-term rental host infrastructure that's doing their best to do the best for the community. In other words, to improve the quality of life in the community on many different levels. And I think that when you consider the fact that the average short-term rental, maybe Julie went over some of these statistics, but you're talking about mom and pop. You're talking about folks that on the whole have a very small number of, the majority of the short-term rental hosts have a couple of units. Anything to elevate each other and empower each other and support each other
it's going to benefit the community. But simply regulating something doesn't improve anybody's performance. It just keeps, it's good for collecting fees and it's good for raising funds. But at the whole, I don't think it empowers anybody to move, to do good or fast or better. And that's where I think that we could look at other cities to see what their vision is, their purpose with regards to short-term rental. And just simply to say we're going to regulate to enforce safety is falling far short of all that we're capable of doing as a community. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor for adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Who seconded? Who made the motion? Oh. Who did? Earl?
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ms. Marks.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Dempster. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.